Hi, Ashley. So,
Hi.
Ashley Shapiro is a board certified educational therapist and executive director of edcahoots, which is a one to one educational therapy practice, which she founded in 2010 with offices in Los Angeles and Greenwich. Ashley serves on the board of directors of the Association of Educational Therapists, the Educational Therapy Advisory Board for the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she's an adjunct professor at the California State University of Northridge. She's presented for the Los Angeles County Psychological Association, the Association of Educational Therapists, and private schools throughout the country on a variety of topics, including understanding and treating reading disabilities, approaching ethical dilemmas in clinical practice, kindergarten readiness, keeping diverse learners engaged in virtual school, and promoting executive functioning skills in the classroom. So thank you so much, Ashley, for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, I want to start with how does kids' technology use affect their learning experience inside the classroom? I know you work with a lot of kids um, on one-to-one, but you're privy to what you're seeing going on inside the classroom as well.
Absolutely. Here's the thing. I think our bodies and brains prefer the path to least resistance. And so what we see happening with technology use is that there's very high reward with very low effort. So you can play a video game or have access to kind of this technological world, even in certain learning games technologically, in which you don't have to put forth that much effort, but you get a lot of reward and stimulation. And so the impact I think we're seeing in the classroom, from that is that we are seeing an environment with less reward, but higher effort demands. And so kids are starting to disengage because they have become so accustomed to this technological world with low effort, high reward. And in the classroom, it's high effort and kind of less obvious reward. When you solve, let's say, a math problem, you don't necessarily get that same dopamine hit as when you're playing Grand Theft Auto and you're stealing a car.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So we've covered the classroom a little bit. Do you think modern screen technology, which is really what we're talking about in the context of this conversation, used for entertainment helps or hurts academics in school? So I know you just covered sort of the way that there's really no boundaries, right? Where they're getting that reward at home maybe, and then at school it's a little harder. So let's talk about how that helps or hurts academics.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the age, but I think in our youngest students, entertainment programming has been proven to have a negative relationship with development cognitively, and I believe even physically, because technology use is being linked to obesity, lack of movement. So I think in our youngest ages, it's definitely not helping us academically. And I think attention span, as we just touched on, is being negatively affected. And I think it's making teachers' jobs more difficult because they're really competing with a world of high stimulation, high excitement, high reward. And, a teacher in a classroom, even two teachers in a classroom, can only do so much to make the world that stimulating. And we experience it in my practice as well. We have certain kids who come in um, who have a history of high tech use, and it's almost as though we challenge ourselves to start jumping through hoops to get content across to them. And it
Mm-hmm.
takes kind of an experienced educator to recognize, is this a me problem? Right? Are my teaching practices just not adaptive enough to this new generation? Or is this generation being overstimulated in a way that is not actually helpful to their learning? And in our older students, I think entertainment programming is leading to isolation, it's leading to dependency. And I think kids just across the board are engaging less in their academics and in their classroom. Um, and I think, aspects of entertainment technology are to blame.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So this next one's a bit of a loaded question, but is learning in person the same as learning on a screen?
So I know most of us dealt with that during the pandemic, and I think we would all hope that the answer to that was, oh, yes, they're absolutely synonymous. Unfortunately, we lose the social aspect, I think, of learning, and certain social norms, expectations of classroom behavior when we are engaged in a virtual environment. It's not to say that virtual learning hasn't given us great tools and resources. I mean, one of which, the most important one, is accessibility, right, across the world to educational programming. So I think it's just that there also is reason for in-person learning. In our field, we're fairly frustrated by providers who have chosen to not go back to the office, to be honest. I think
Hmm.
this extends beyond the classroom. I think virtual learning is an amazing tool for a specific context, and again, has the benefits of accessibility. But I think when we can get people in person, if we have that choice, I really hope that we choose to capitalize on it, because I think that we still need to be preparing children in particular for the human experience of sitting in a classroom, engaging with peers, teamwork, collaboration, and engagement without distraction. So I do think it is different, but I do see that there are benefits of both environments.
Yeah, I mean, you did touch on the social emotional aspect, but isn't there also, I remember one of the other experts just talking about the nuance that's lost from 2D to 3D, right? Because our brains
Yeah,
process things in three dimensions. And, even this conversation we're having today, while I can see you, I'm not picking up on certain visual cues and just things that go beyond sound, right? Is there something to
absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's something to hands-on learning engagement, right? So not only picking up on the social norms of the classroom and reading the room, where am I supposed to be? What am I supposed to be attending to? But in this environment, you've chosen for me where to focus my attention, right? It's very clear. You're
Yeah.
in front of me. I can focus on this screen. My only challenge is to tune out my room, and I can control my setting right now. But imagine sitting in a classroom with 30 other students. This student next to you is tapping his finger, the teacher's roaming around the room. There's children running outside the window at recess. There's a lot of other distractions, and we actually have to learn how to attend and participate in a classroom environment. But also, we lose hands-on learning experiences. So clicking and dragging is very different than having to you can construct a 3D model in a classroom using your hands and feeling shapes and feeling materials and sitting side by side with someone, not just over chat, but actually having to collaborate to execute a project.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So speaking of social emotional, what issues, social emotional issues, do you see in your practice, and how do you think that relates to technology use?
Yeah, so we see a lot of parents referring their child in for executive function weaknesses. So my child's really struggling to plan and prioritize, and they can focus all day on their preferred screen activity, but they're really struggling to complete their work academically. And so kids are showing up with shame, depression, lack of volition, and real difficulty kind of executing tasks that are maybe not preferred, like homework. Um, I think, screen use and technology use that is fairly unregulated in the home, I think is contributing to a lot of these difficulties for kids, because again, their brain is going to choose this path of least resistance. And this is a highly motivating world.
Hmm.
Technology makes things accessible, fast, and learning is not always fast and enjoyable. We try to make it as enjoyable as possible, which is something we do as educators, right? But it's not always that way. So we are seeing students really start to present with depression. I think social media is a large contributor to depression, and I think parents are really struggling to navigate exposure and the age of appropriate exposure. But the loneliness, the isolation, the self-comparison, and then you add to that, I work with students with learning disabilities. So these children are already a vulnerable population, and they already start with, let's say, an academic disadvantage in some way in the area of their weakness. When you
Hmm.
add to that some type of technology dependency, and you give their brain kind of what it's been hoping for and craving, it really can make this picture even more difficult, let alone kids with ADHD are at higher risk for dependency. And so, they're at higher risk for addiction in general. And so this risk for dependency, and then you give their brain this highly stimulating world and this highly stimulating environment that's very rewarding. and then you ask them, the next day to sit in a classroom that doesn't have all these bells and whistles, it just makes the whole learning process for them more difficult. So yeah, I mean, we don't treat the psychological, we refer to therapists for depression and anxiety, but we are experts in looking at the intersection of these social and emotional issues and how they impact learning. And absolutely, if you have students who are starting to disengage from their learning, they're kind of dropping out of the academic world.
Mm-hmm. So let's push on that a little bit more, because you mentioned kids with learning differences, which is what you do day to day. So you touched a little bit on the negatives of technology use, but maybe we can balance it and talk about the positives and negatives, because I'm sure
Yeah.
there's a little bit of both.
Yeah, so the positives are adaptive technology gives our students access to worlds that they could not otherwise access, right? So for a student with dyslexia to have access to audiobooks, to have access to screen readers, to have access to note-taking devices. I mean, these are all really positive uses of technology. For kids struggling with ADHD, executive function skills, and just the rest of us, having automated reminders on our devices, calendaring systems, digital folders and organization systems, and now AI being able to help generate main ideas and extrapolate details for us. I mean, this is a whole world that truly could be extra beneficial when used appropriately. And I think it's on parents and educators to make sure that we are ahead of this technology and that we are modeling appropriate use of it. And I really commend schools right now that have put out AI statements and not said, we don't allow the use of AI, but have particularly said, we do allow the use of AI and here's how we use it, because it can really enhance the learning process, and particularly for kids with learning disabilities. I mean, imagine as a teacher, you're struggling to get a point across to a student and you say, or the student learns to self-generate, give me 10 analogies that will relay this concept to a child who's struggling to understand it. So if we can model that for a child could type into AI, I'm struggling to understand, the socioeconomic impact of this event in world history. Can you give me a relevant modern day analogy to help me? That's beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the risks are significant, especially when unregulated and not appropriately modeled. And I think we know that people from lower socioeconomic status are even more vulnerable, right, in this academic world, and let alone are using technology more frequently in younger ages, according to research. And so the risks are big, the risks of dependency, isolation, loneliness, shame. And that's where I get very concerned, because I think the same tools that we're hoping benefit all populations and bring greater accessibility to learning across the world are the same tools that are actually, taking down our brains if we're not using them thoughtfully.
Yeah, when I hear you talk, I just absolutely resonate with this idea of using technology as a tool, which is the way we model it in our own house. But I mean, I think for the everyday parent, it's often used more on that entertainment side, which you talked about earlier, which is brings up a lot of the challenges, right? Whether it's distraction or loneliness or any of the other things we talked about. So I do think your point about focusing on the tools and modeling how to use technology as a tool is super important, whether
I
that's
mean,
in school.
here's the thing. Creativity stems from boredom. And
Mm-hmm.
from a very young age, if we erase children's ability to be bored and we
Yeah.
hand them technology to fill in this space, they go
Yeah.
from being active learners and active engagers in their world to passive recipients.
Mm-hmm.
And while that can be very attractive in a parenting moment to have a very
Yeah.
passive child just say sure and do things, and in a classroom, a very passive learner, right, just nods and says yes, that's
Yeah.
not actually what our world is going to demand from this century and this generation of participants, right? We want individuals who are so
Mm-hmm.
bored that they go sit in their room and generate song lyrics on their own, or
Mm-hmm.
decide to draw, or decide to pick up a book and read. And I think that when we're offering students technology, children technology, we're taking away their boredom. And we need to speak to our own challenges as adults. I mean, we now disengage from our own brain within 3 seconds, I would say, of not having something to do, right? We pick up our phone, we scroll, we look at our calendar. And so while it's both a useful device answering what do I have to do next or connecting with family and friends, it's also not allowing my brain any freedom to generate new ideas. And we are adults with developed frontal lobes, but we have to
Yeah.
remember that kids' frontal lobes are not fully developed till they're about 25 years of age, and that's even further delayed for kids with attention deficit disorder. So
Mm.
it's, we're putting a weapon into their hands at a very young age that is not designed, in my understanding of how these tools are designed. I don't think they're designed for a 6-year-old's brain or even a 12-year-old's brain. I think
No.
they are very much designed behind the scenes by very intelligent marketing agents and psychologists who ask themselves, how often can we get people to use these tools? And we're putting in the hands of children who don't have the self-regulation yet developed. And if you're a child with a learning disability who's already experiencing shame or psychological issues around your learning, and then you give them a tool that stimulates these reward pathways, you're inviting dependency and addiction as soon as you hand over that device. And when we do that, we are then further inviting a child to disengage from the learning process and become a passive recipient.
Yeah, I mean, as a social media marketer since 2007, basically the beginning, I can confirm that these products absolutely are not designed for kids in any way. They
Yeah,
happen
I
to
will.
adopt, but they're not designed with kids in mind. So,
One of my
um,
second passions, just based on my undergraduate degree, is ethics. I'm really passionate about ethics, and I've spoken in our association about ethical decision making. But I often question what ethicist was invited to these boards when these technologies were released for children, right? Did anyone have the discussion? I hope they do. I just don't know. But I think these are discussions we can have as parents, as schools, as professionals in the world before we release technology to our children. And I think we do need to recognize it is within our control to decide to hand over devices. But we need to have ethical discussions about, what am I handing over and what are the risks? What is the content exposure risk? I mean, you realize when children get exposed to things at an age too young, they're sitting in class all day thinking about what they just saw, and they're
yeah,
really not available to engage in a lesson that isn't nearly as interesting as whatever they just learned about accidentally.
sure. That makes so much sense. Okay, so my last question, and I believe we touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about some of the challenges that caregivers, so that could be faculty or parents, that you've seen. What are the challenges they've experienced in relation to student tech use? What are some of the things you've seen?
So I think technology is being used heavily right now, at least in our city. I don't know how broadly I can speak to this, but probably worldwide, um, or at least nationally, as a reward and consequence for a lot of students, right? So if you complete your homework, you can have your screen time in this way. So I think parents are really struggling to navigate the use of technology in their home, and their relationship and their children's relationship to technology. I think caregivers are also struggling with how to regulate technology use, right? So even my own children who do not have access to iPads, they do have access to like our Google Home, right, which we use for our Nest Cam. And I've
Hmm.
noticed that they're able to ask Google Home to play certain music videos and stuff like that. So instantly I'm researching, right? How do I shut down this viewing, these
Yeah.
programs that I don't want them to have access to? And so
Hmm.
I use that as an example just to say, I think, I'm just a microcosm for what's going on around technology use, but parents are struggling to stay ahead of how to control content that they're willing to let their children be exposed to. Um, and I think caregivers in general, or I think educators, excuse me, are struggling with the use of AI in the classroom now. I think this is going to be the challenge of the next decade. And again, I think that's where we need to step up and familiarize ourselves with all these tools and resources and figure out how to be modeling appropriate use of all technology as adults. And I hope that your children and my children and this generation pushes back on adults. I really would love these kids to say, we've decided to use flip phones again. We saw you all be on your phones all the time. We saw you all say you can't drive and text. And yet I swear I see you doing it. Mom, I'd like a flip phone.
Hmm.
I think it would be amazing.
I've seen movements. There's a movement out of New York that's exactly what you're describing. Kids that have said, they're teenagers. mom, dad's addicted. We're done with this. It's hurting our mental health. And that's where the positive side of this comes in, right? Because they're getting the information to inform them that this causes anxiety and depression, right? So they're saying they've given up their smartphones in favor of flip phones. They're spending time in parks, things like that. So it is growing. And I
That's
agree with
amazing.
you. I do think there is a tipping point where this generation is starting to see some of these societal issues and feel these things themselves and be very self-aware. So I'm optimistic.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that.
Well, Ashley, I really, really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you so much for what you do every day and for spending time with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing effort.